Today we're going to be talking about how to build a PC for Blender. This video is sponsored by Micro Center. Disclaimer up front, this is not a video about how to physically build a PC. If that's the type of video you're looking for, Linus Tech Tips already has a great in-depth video on that. I recommend checking out their videos for that. What we're going to be talking about is how to build out a computer in terms of picking out the specs that'll best perform for Blender. So this video is going to be broken into two parts. In the first part, we're going to be talking about the different parts of a PC and how they affect performance in Blender. Now, you can get really deep into each piece of hardware. However, this video is going to kind of keep knowledge at an upper level. This video is meant to get people comfortable with looking at their first PC build. In the second half of the video, what we're going to do is go through how to actually pick out PC parts, make sure they're compatible. We're going to look at some low tier, mid tier, and high tier options, and I'm going to offer recommendations in each one of those categories. In regards to recommended options, if you're interested in something that we don't talk about in this video, I highly recommend checking out opendata.blender.org. It's an official Blender website, and here the community submits statistics for various CPUs and GPUs. And you can see here we have the top benchmarks listed. And if you come up here and click compare more, you more than likely will find whatever CPU or GPU you're interested in on this list. And you can take a look at the performance and see if you feel that it would be best fit for your needs. Now, with that being said, let's dive into the different PC parts and how they affect performance in Blender. Now, I've done my research to try and offer the most accurate information I could in terms of how different parts work with performance in Blender in terms of viewport and rendering. However, Blender's constantly updating, so if I accidentally have any out-of-date information or get anything wrong, please let us know politely in the comments. That would be helpful. First up, talking about processors, also known as CPUs. You can actually render on your CPU in Blender, and what you'll do is you'll notice that you have more tiles and they'll be smaller, and that's because you're getting one tile per core. You can also render hybrid, where you render with your CPU and your GPU together. In my experience, more often than not, it's better just to render on your GPU, not your CPU, and not hybrid. However, there are exceptions. So where CPU comes in handy in Blender performance is going to be mostly in your viewport, things like caching your renders and moving around your scene. However, as I said, Blender's constantly changing, so this also changes. Right now, there's a mixture of single core operations where Blender only uses one core on your processor to process whatever it's calculating, or there's other operations that use multi-threading when possible. So truth be told, what you want to do is try and get a good balance between the two. So when you look at how a processor works, oftentimes the two primary things you're going to be looking at are the amount of cores on it and then how powerful those cores are, which is measured in gigahertz. So generally what you want to do is try and pick a balance between these two to create a versatile processor for most scenarios in Blender. That way it's good at kind of everything. And generally how it works is the more cores you have, the weaker they're going to be. The less cores you have, the stronger they're going to be. Now, of course, these aren't the only two components that make up a processor. There's a lot going on inside of these things that can affect performance. So you could have a high gigahertz processor be much slower than another one with a low gigahertz. So to help make this easier, the companies have kind of invented a tiering system. So for example, Intel has i5, i7, i9 getting increasingly more powerful, and AMD will have something like Ryzen going 3000, 5000 in a similar manner. So pay attention to that tiering when you're picking and kind of picking for your price range. We'll look at some of those options later in the video. Now, arguably the most important part of your Blender build is going to be your GPU, also known as your graphics card. And what this graphics card does will affect a lot of things in the viewport in terms of performance. And then, of course, you're going to be using it to render. So having a good GPU is the most important thing when you're kind of speccing out a 3D computer. Now, you can have multiple GPUs and do a render farm, but we're going to be focusing on single card setups. Now, there's two major brands of video cards. You have AMD and then you have NVIDIA. Also, Mac just recently released the M1 chip, which is proprietary to Macs. And historically speaking, Blender has supported NVIDIA the longest and oftentimes operated best on NVIDIA. However, recently, they've been doing some more AMD updates, and there's some future updates for AMD on the way, and also M1 chips. All of them are good options. However, since NVIDIA's had support for the longest and also has support for the future, I kind of recommend that as the safest option to move forward with for now. So paying attention to the different parts of a video card and what we need to be looking for. So first of all, we want to pay attention to things like clock speed and CUDA cores, making sure that it has a higher clock speed and that it has a good amount of CUDA cores, as that's what NVIDIA is going to be using to render our scene. We also need to pay attention to VRAM. And VRAM stands for video RAM, meaning that it's going to be able to load your scene into the card so that it can then begin rendering it. Anything that can't fit into your VRAM will spill over into the regular RAM, which we'll talk about later. Now, you've probably heard the terms RTX or optics rendering, and this is exclusive to NVIDIA's RTX cards. And what these cards do is they have basically more processors, and it's meant for ray tracing in video games. However, what we can do in 3D is tap into those processors and get faster renders. So I definitely recommend RTX cards as your primary cards for rendering if you can afford one. We'll talk about some options with those later. Next up, we'll be talking about RAM, and RAM differs from VRAM that we just talked about on your video card. VRAM is specifically on your video card for tasks that it's handling. RAM is for your computer on everything else, but Blender also utilizes this. RAM stands for random access memory, and it's basically temporary memory that Blender can tap into and use for performance improvements, rendering, and more. Now, RAM affects everything in your scene performance-wise. It affects modeling, it affects sculpting, textures, particles, when you go to render, and more. It's just a very important piece for Blender's functionality. Now, I feel like memory management's one of the most common crashes or performance problems that people experience in Blender. And what that basically means is that the amount of objects or details or particles in your scene will then exceed the amount of RAM you have and cause Blender to crash. Sometimes people are working in their viewport and they have certain things turned off, for example, particles, and then they go to hit render and then it crashes because it doesn't have enough RAM to load all of those particles. A way around that is using render layers where you only render portions of your scene. However, the more RAM you have, the less likely you have to micromanage everything in your scene. The more details you can put in there, the more dense geometry you can use. So having more RAM will definitely help with performance, less crashes, and allowing you to create denser scenes overall. RAM's pretty easy when you're picking it out. What you want to look at is the kind of type of RAM. So you have DDR4 RAM, and then you have DDR5 RAM. DDR5 RAM can have about 30% more power, and it actually consumes less electricity, thus not draining your power supply as much, which we'll talk about later. However, DDR5 isn't as supported yet because it is newer. And usually, whenever they go from one RAM type to the other, it takes a while for things to get stable. I'm personally still using DDR4, but you may want to consider getting a motherboard that supports DDR5 RAM if that's something that you want to upgrade to in the future. Speed is also important when you're picking RAM. Some common numbers to see are like 3600, 3200. The higher that number is, the faster that RAM is and the more efficient it will be. However, in Blender, you're going to be needing a lot of RAM. So hobbyists will be around 8 to 16. Professionals will be around 16 to 32. And then a lot of people doing more things like simulations and stuff are going to want 64 gigs of RAM. So it may become unreasonably expensive to have the highest speed RAM when you have that much in your system. So I'd recommend prioritizing the amount of RAM over the speed of RAM, but also be careful because if you go too slow, then that can also kind of lead to performance issues as well. Now, the motherboard is the backbone of your computer. So basically, you're going to plug everything into it, your GPU, your power supply, your processor, and that's really how your computer is going to know how to operate. So it's very important. Some things you want to look for are how many slots you have on it so you can install future video cards if you want. You'll also want to look at kind of future-proofing it, making sure it supports the RAM you have and supports maybe future RAM such as DDR5, making sure that it supports future processors. So if you buy an i7 processor, you can make sure you get a board that also supports i9. So if you want to save up an upgrade, you can do that. Luckily, with the PC part builders, they recommend motherboards for you, and then they list out everything it can support. So it sounds overwhelming, but it's pretty easy if you're using a PC part builder, which I'll show you one later, and we'll kind of walk through how to check and make sure it has everything that you may want in the future. Now, looking at how power supplies work in our computers, they're going to supply power to all of our components. So what you need to make sure is that the power supply you pick is powerful enough to support everything you pick. Higher end processors and higher end video cards are going to draw more power. And I've seen where people upgrade their computers and they don't upgrade their power supply, and suddenly they're running into crashes all the time because the power supply can't keep up. Luckily, as I mentioned before, we'll be using a PC part builder, which will look at our components and recommend us some power supplies that will work for the components that we've picked. Also, just taking a moment to talk about hard drives. Hard drives will drastically improve the performance of Blender because they're going to affect your loading speed of everything it's accessing and the software itself. Now, there's NVMe.2 hard drives, which are kind of small solid state drives that are super fast. Then you have solid state, your basic solid state drive. Those are pretty fast. And then you have a hard drive. Those are slower, but you can get higher RPM ones. Generally, what I would recommend is looking for an NVMe 2 hard drive to store your operating system on, and then a solid state drive with a larger capacity to store all of your assets on. That's how I work, and I find it to be highly efficient. One last thing, and then we're going to jump into the actual part building and recommendations. So you need to consider your case and your cooling. So you're going to have a heat sink on your processor. More often than not, you can buy a processor with one, and you need to make sure you have temperature paste on that processor. We're not going to go through the process of how to build that. Linus Tech Tips already has that, as I mentioned. But when you're picking a case, try and pick something larger, as it'll give more room for the heat to dissipate. I've worked on smaller computers and they just burn out after a couple of years because when we're rendering for many, many hours. And that's kind of unique to what we do in 3D. Now, when you're using a part building website, it will recommend cases that should have good cooling for the setup that you have. And then you will also notice that some of these cases come with fans pre-built in. So if you're nervous about picking fans, that's a good way to go. And fans themselves are usually pretty cheap. And you can get away with mid-range options. You don't need to buy super expensive fans. You just don't want it to burn out in the middle of your render. So you'll notice here on the Blender website, they actually have a requirements section for the hardware where they go through everything. They show you the minimum requirements and they show you the recommended requirements. Now, I will say that I have worked at these minimum requirements and it is very limiting, but you can still produce artwork. You just may have to be more stylistic or more particular about it, or you're going to be waiting a lot longer on renders. Here's some of the animations that I did when I was working on a machine similar spec to this. Now I'm more over here on the recommended end, and I highly recommend this. You could actually bump your graphic card up to 12 gigabytes of RAM and go all the way up to 64 gigabytes of RAM and see a huge performance boost. Of course, that's going to get a lot more expensive. But with that being said, let's dive in and actually look at some parts and how we can begin building our own PC. It's also worth noting the Micro Center wants to offer new customers a free 128 gigabyte USB flash drive and 128 gigabyte micro SD card. See the link in the description below. This is for new customers only. There's no purchase necessary and it's a limited time offer. Valid in-store only and a limit of 1 coupon per customer. So we're actually going to be using Micro Center to do our PC part building. They have a great free tool and then they have some community tools as well. So I accepted them as a sponsor because I actually built my first computer at Micro Center and I've bought a lot of my parts there. And there was one instance where I had an issue with the part from the manufacturer and they took care of it right away. I've always gotten great service. They have great deals and now they have all these great tools on their website. So I'm going to show you how to use those. They're incredibly helpful. And as I mentioned, free. So one great tool I love that they have on Micro Center is this community showcase your custom PC. And what you could do is come up here and search for things. So if I search for Blender, it's going to show me computers that people have built for Blender. So if you're feeling overwhelmed building your own or you don't like the options here, you can come here and look and see what other people are doing. And then you can sort by price. So if you want, you can look at some kind of like cheaper options and what other people have had success with. And then if you go up here, they actually have all these communities and other things where you can go and ask more in-depth questions, ask questions about PC builds. They have guides and everything. It's a really helpful community. So you can go there and get more information if you want, or if you're unsure about something. But with that being said, let's dive into the part building tool and look at some options for ourselves. So here we have this PC part building tool. And what this is going to let us do is select an option from one category. And then when we go to select an option in another category, it'll only display compatible parts, which makes it super easy to pick out parts, especially for things like motherboard or RAM, where things can kind of get finicky with compatibility. You can save lists if you want. It'll show you your build total up here. You can organize everything by price. So if you're following along with me, and you don't like the options, I recommend you could sort by lowest price, maybe pick something a bit lower if you're looking for something more budget friendly. They have CPU, cooling, software, peripherals, accessories, but we're going to be focusing on the core components up here, which is what we've been discussing this entire video. So I like to start with the video card, as I believe that's the most important part of a 3D computer. So I'm going to go ahead here, click select video card, and I'll clear all my filters here. And what we can do is we can filter down to NVIDIA, and then we'll come down here to GPU series. And you can see here that it gets increasingly powerful as it goes. We have the GeForce GT 1000, then the GTX 1000, then the GTX 1600, then the 2000, where we have the RTX and the RTX 3000. Now, I worked on a 1000 series card, and it's certainly possible. This is like a very budget friendly video card. However, you're going to be pretty limited in what you do. If you're doing things like Eevee and lower end scenes, this is going to work great. But I always dealt with a lot of lag in my scenes when trying to do character animation. But if you're trying to find something budget friendly, you can do a 1000 series, or you can go a little higher and do a 1600 series. You can see they have some better options in here, but they are starting to get more pricey. Now, what I would recommend if you can is saving up and going mid tier, especially if you're doing this professionally at all, and going 2000. And then the way the RTX cards works is it'll go the number first, which is like 2000. And then at the end, they have 60, 70, or 80, getting increasingly more powerful. So a good mid-tier card to me would be a 2060 or a 2070. And you can see here that they vary in price depending on how much video RAM they have and other factors. So here, this 12 gigabyte is $430. But if we look at this one's only $390. So that's one way you can save money if you want to go lower on the video RAM. Now, if you're looking for a high tier option, I recommend the GeForce RTX 3000. These things are finally coming back in stock. They were out of stock forever. And if you want to get really high end, you get the 390 Ti, but you can see that those get extremely expensive. However, they are very fast cards that will last you a long time. Personally, I wouldn't spend that much on a video card, but if you have the money and you want, you can. You can go ahead and get a lower end 380 or a 360, and you see how the price drops literally thousands of dollars. So that's what I would recommend for a high-end computer. So what we're going to do is we're going to build out kind of a middle ground computer as an example, but I'll still show you low, mid, and high tier options on all of them. So I'm going to go ahead, select the RTX 2000 series, and I'm going to select this MSI one, and you can see here that it has a rebate, but I'm picking this one because it has 12 gigabytes of RAM and it's a 2060. So that's going to be great for a lot of hobbyist work and some professional work. It's going to be pretty powerful. So I'm going to go ahead, select that one, and then we're ready to move on. So next, what I'm going to focus on is the CPU. So moving on to the CPU, this is because we want to make sure our CPU and our GPU are going to be compatible with the motherboard we pick. So once we select our CPU, it'll only display some motherboards that will work for both. So let's go ahead, select CPU here. And if we click clear all, we can clear our filters up here. And you'll have these Intel-based processors called i357, and then you'll have AMD processors, which are like Ryzen. Now, I've heard that Ryzen and the Ryzen Threadrippers are currently performing better in Blender. However, both are great options. And you can see here that they're tiered. So if you're on a lower end machine, you can go ahead and get something like kind of in the Ryzen 5 or i5 series. And you can see here that we have cheaper options. I wouldn't go this cheap. It can make it kind of hard to do certain scenes. I would try and recommend staying above 3 gigahertz if you can, to kind of move around scenes more. This would be what I would recommend as a low tier option. Coming up here to the middle tier, we'll say the i7. So with the i7, you can see here that we have a 12 core 3.6. That's going to be pretty fast and be able to handle most things. You can get by in an 8 core 2 though and save yourself $150. And then if you're going on a higher end machine, you'll want to look at things like the Ryzen 9s or the i9s, and these prices are pretty similar. And you can see here that we have varying options in here. You can see up here that we have a 3.5 gigahertz at 8 cores, which would be great. And down here, you can see we start getting some that are much faster. So what we're going to do is go ahead and choose an i7 here, as we're kind of building out a middle tier computer for this example. And I'm going to go ahead and choose one of these 8 core options. And I'm just going to choose this 3.6 gigahertz with 8 cores. That's not like super fast. You'd want the 12 cores, but it's $150 cheaper. So we'll kind of go with that for now. And you can always potentially upgrade that later. Now we have both of these options. So when we click motherboard, which to me is usually the scary part of trying to find a compatible motherboard, it'll only display compatible options for us. So let's go ahead, select our motherboard here, and you'll see that it'll display all these options here. And it's giving us 15 options. And you'll see that there's kind of some variance in pricing, but motherboards are a lot different than other components. They tend to kind of be a lot closer to each other in prices. They don't vary, I would say, as much. So you'll see here that you can find some for 180. Now, what happens is if you click these, you'll get kind of all the specs twirling down. And what you can do is look at your CPU support. So let's say that we bought an i7, but we might want to upgrade to an i9. We see here that it supports i9, but we see that we have maximum memory supported here is 32 gigs, and we have the DDR RAM here. So we can see the different types we have, and then the different speeds of RAM that we have here as well. And then coming down here, the maximum amount of RAM supported is 128 gigs. You just want to make sure that's at least 64 gigs since we're kind of doing 3D, making sure it has an M.2 port type so that we can put in those solid state drives that I mentioned. And those are kind of like the main things you'd look at. You can also look at slots up here too, making sure you have multiple slots to plug things in and that it's not too tiny that everything can kind of fit out. But if I go ahead and click that again to bring that down, we can go ahead and kind of pick a middle tier one here, something around like 180 here. If we click this MSI one, we can see that it supports the i9, that it supports memory type of DDR4, and that it has M2 slots and kind of everything that we're looking for. So we'll go ahead and select that one. If you want to future-proof more, I would recommend going with one that supports DDR5 as well, just to make sure that you can upgrade that RAM in the future. But so we're building on a middle tier, we're going to go ahead and select that one there. And then next, what we're going to do is select our RAM. So we'll go ahead and we'll do 32 gigs of RAM. Now, you can clear all the types here. There's different types of RAM, but Corsair is generally the most recommended type of RAM, and Corsair Vengeance is what I've heard is working best with Blender currently. So if we go ahead, click Corsair here, and then we see that most of these options are already Vengeance, and we can go ahead and choose a set here. We have this set right up here, recommended, which is the Corsair Vengeance. It's 32 gigs of RAM, DDR4 3600. So this is going to be pretty fast and pretty robust for only $160. You can go down here, you can go cheaper. You can see here that you could get 16 gigabytes. So let's say that we're building more of like a upper middle tier hobbyist computer. So we're actually going to go down here, choose this one, 16 gigs, 3200. That's only $75. So that won't add a ton to your computer. You're generally going to dump the most money into your video card and your processor. And great. With that, we've kind of gotten a lot of the base components out of the way. And now it's kind of filling in some of what we're just feel are maybe some of the cheaper or safer options for the rest. Now coming back up here, next up we can go ahead, let's select our power supply, and it's just going to recommend one that works for you. You don't want to go super cheap on our power supply, but you see that most of these are kind of around the same price point with the exception of one or two. So I'd recommend just kind of choosing one. I'm going to go ahead, choose a Corsair one, knowing that that's more of a kind of name brand that I know can be trusted as well. And then what we can do is come down here and choose our hard drives. So we'll go ahead, first what we want to choose is this NVMe SSD. Go ahead, choose that. And here things can get kind of pricey. So what you want to do is you want to go ahead and organize by the capacity and what you feel you need for your operating system. 250 gigs to 500 gigabytes should be more than enough as long as you're not storing other files on here. And you can see that we kind of have these options here. These Samsungs are like kind of the best ones out right now, at least that I've seen. Let me know in the comments if you've heard anything else. So we'll go ahead, select this $50 Samsung right here, and that'll give us our operating system hard drive. And then we're going to want a hard drive, a solid state drive to kind of store all of our working files on. So that's where our projects will sit, all the assets, the textures, and things like that. So we'll come here, we'll select a hard drive here. And again, we're going to go ahead and organize by capacity. These things are pretty sturdy. We're just going to go ahead, choose 1 terabyte to 2 terabytes. 3D files generally aren't that big aside from texture files, but you're likely not going to fill up your hard drive with texture files unless you're doing like a ton of architectural rendering. So we'll go ahead here. We'll do 1 terabyte to 2 terabyte. We'll go ahead and we'll look at our options here. Next up, we're going to choose a hard drive for storage. Now, if you're looking to kind of save money, you can go for a normal hard drive. This would be kind of the low tier option. And you can go ahead, come down here to capacity, select the lowest one at 1 terabyte. And you can see you can get hard drives for like $35. However, this is going to slow down your scenes because you're going to access your files slower, but this would be the cheapest option. Now, if we come up here to the 2.5 SSD. That's going to give us a much faster option. This will pick a middle tier option from here. So what we're going to do is come down here. We want to organize by capacity. Now we're going to be storing quite a bit of files. I'd really recommend 1 to 2 terabytes, but if you're going for a budget computer and you don't mind managing your file space, you could go ahead for 500 to 70 gigabytes. So we'll go ahead and look at our options there. And you can see that we can pick some of these options here. I recommend SanDisk as kind of like the best one that I'm familiar with. Again, recommend any other options you have there. So we'll go ahead and select a 512 gigabyte. This is to save money. I would recommend going a 1 or 2 terabyte there. And with that, we've kind of built out all the main components of our computer. So now what we want to do is go ahead and select a case, and it will recommend us some cases. Now they can get more expensive, usually because they look cooler or have a lot more lights. I don't really care about that. I just want to make sure that it kind of has some pre-built fans in it and like a decent price. So I can see here that we have this large one that's a glass case. It's $100. It has some fans in it. So we can go ahead and select that. And now we kind of have our computer built out. So we could go ahead, add all those to the carts. This ended up being a $1,300 computer. If that price scares you, I recommend going ahead and picking a different video card. You could easily pick a video card $100 to $200 cheaper if you wanted, and potentially going down to an i5. So with that, that's how I would recommend building out a PC. After that, you have all the parts you need. You can either watch a video, put it together yourself, or you could go ahead and order it and get it put it together at the store. It's not that much more expensive, and then you know that it's done right, because things like thermal paste and your CPU cooling and stuff can be scary. A lot of those parts are fragile. With that being said, I hope that you found this video useful. This is something that I wish I had known when I was starting in Blender, because I had built out my computer and I ended up not really optimizing it. I didn't have a ton of RAM and I was just constantly running into memory crashes and things like that and didn't know why. So I hope you found this useful. I'd also love to hear what options you recommend, what hardware you're using. So comment your PC specs below, maybe the PC specs you have or the dream specs you want. And again, thank you for watching. Super excited to announce that my new asset pack is available both on Blender Market and Gumroad. At launch, it's on sale, so the quicker you buy it, the cheaper it is. There's also a sample pack if you'd like to check out a portion of it before committing. So if you'd like to learn more, check it out in the description below. As usual, thank you for watching, and tag me in your creations at Southern Shoddy on Instagram and Twitter so that I can see what you've made. If you're interested in supporting the channel or getting some project files, I do have a Patreon and products that I sell. Links in the description below.